Good evening. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very excited to be here, to meet all the people here, and of course, to see Abuelaish, Dr. Ziauddin Abuelaish, after many, many years, and his courage, and what you've done here in Toronto, and this foundation. I received a phone call from Dr. Abuelaish on Friday, 5 o'clock afternoon. I was on the live show during the news broadcasting at Channel 10 when I was working for. And during the live show, I just saw he's calling me. I've seen my phone and flashing his number, his name, Dr. Ziauddin Abuelaish. And I had a feeling that I must answer this phone. I must, even if it's against the rule of, the broadcasting channel. But I was waiting for a while, but I saw that he still calling and calling, and I decided against any rule of broadcasting, any channel around the world, to answer this phone. I took the phone, and I've heard the voices from Gaza Strip. I've heard Dr. Ziauddin Abuelaish said, "They killed my daughters." And in 1 minute, 1 second, I decide this is the time that I must spread out these voices from Gaza Strip. Because until then, the 21 days after the cast started, the Israelis audience, the TV audience and the Israeli channels were so apathic for the casualty of Gaza.
They related the numbers and they meant...
Just number, because I think that all my coverage, all my reporter from Gaza Strip, I had a crew in Gaza Strip, and I broadcasted all the time the stories of the retaliation of the Israelis. And I must say that I said it before, I think it was a brutal response for the Qassam rockets. And I decided to push my speaker and spread out the voices. And all the Israelis could hear the tragedy of people in Gaza Strip. Not only Dr. Abuelaish's tragedy, but all the civilians in Gaza Strip. And one thing that I would like to mention, that what I have been surprised from the Israelis' response. The first time we've heard what I call now the silent majority. We felt the response of the people who were shocked about what happened. Dr. Abuelaish, I think I can compare his opinion that this conversation stopped the war in Gaza, because after 24 hours, Ehud Olmert, the previous prime minister, announced a ceasefire. And unfortunately, Israel, Gaza, Hamas, and Israel experienced 2 more wars after the cast lead.
But you really do think, and it is an extraordinary thing, that one conversation can stop a war.
Yes.
If it reaches deep enough into the heart of human beings.
I think that for the Israelis, for the first time, there was not only numbers. They could, can imagine, they hear the voices for the violence had for one time a face. It took me, I think, weeks to understand that everybody who just met me in the Israeli streets said, when I saw your conversation with Dr. Abuelaish, the doctor from Gaza, I started to cry. And it took me, I think, weeks to understand that my face, they saw my face because they just heard the voices from Gaza, and my face, and I was struggled not to cry on in the live show. I think they were share my face. And my face and the voices from Gaza tells for the Israeli the whole story. The war is not number. When you hear Israel killed 100, 200, 500, 1,000, it's not only number. And we're talking about Palestinians. And as I said before, the response of the Israelis were amazed me, because the first time I've heard a different sound. are different voices from the Israelis. Because during the war, you could hear the Israeli to retaliate to retaliate the Qassam rockets from Gaza Street and to stop it. And if I'm allowed, I want to say something more, because I had, after this conversation, I was working about a documentary, Precious Life, that was broadcasting all over around. And one Israeli wrote me after he saw the documentary, and of course the conversation from Dr. Abuelaish, and he wrote to me an email and said, during the war, the Israelis lived near the border, we were so angry about Hamas, about the Gaza, about what they are doing to our life. But the first time when I see your movie, I understand we are talking about human being. And I think that what happened in the conversation, when the Israeli heard the voices, we are talking about human being.
If I should say Precious Life, you can get it as a DVD. It is it's an extraordinary documentary about a Palestinian mother with a critically ill baby and an Israeli doctor, and how they overcome the situation to save the life of that baby and the complexities involved in it. It's a really remarkable documentary.
And there's one scene in this movie that Dr. Abuelaish we've met at the hospital after the tragedy. Shada was at the hospital, and he said something that included in the documentary. He said, you know, it's crazy. You fought to save one baby for many days, to save one baby from Gaza Strip, and in one hand, kill thousands. So this is the story of the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians.
The craziness of it. And I want, you also had to go to work very quickly when this terrible tragedy happened, because Ziauddin and the children were still stuck in Gaza, still stuck in the house. It was still being pounded by mortar shells.
Yes.
How did you manage to stop that situation? What happened there?
Even when I was very excited during the conversation, this tragic conversation, I realized in the few minutes that I had during the live show that this is my chance to open the border, to evacuate the family to the hospital in Israel, because I knew this is the only way to save them.
And if I could say, because there were 3 critically wounded family members, including Shada, who is here, wonderful Shada, and whose eye was out of her head and whose finger was hanging by a thread with a piece of shrapnel in her hand, and the only place that could operate successfully was an Israeli hospital.
All the family. And of course the border was closed because it was during the war, and I encouraged the IDF to open the border, and that's what they've done. I forced them during the broadcasting, open the border and save the family. And I think that after a few minutes, 1 hour or 2 hours, they just opened the border, the first time during the cast lead, and brought all the family
so the message reached the military.
The message, of course.
Yeah, which it's extraordinary. And then
Ehud Olmert, the prime minister, the previous prime minister, said after 1 year, in an interview to Al Ma'ariv newspaper, and he said that when he saw this conversation, he started to cry. This is Ehud Olmert, the previous prime minister. Well, I think that I don't want to add more.
But it also became very important because in times of conflict and war, there are so many erroneous stories, and people have their own self-interest. So the immediate reaction was for the Israeli Defense Force to say there were terrorists in the house, we were doing our job. And I think it was you who had the idea that you should get into the hospital with Ziauddin and retrieve the shrapnel, a piece of shrapnel from Shada's hand.
Yes.
Is that correct? So that it could be proven where the piece of shrapnel came from?
You know, for the...
And who was in...
Yes, for the IDF it was
because
very...
they also said they hadn't been shelling the house. I mean, that it was someone else.
For the IDF, it was very difficult to admit that Ziauddin Abuelaish family were wounded by the Israeli bomb. It's not simple for them because, you know, it was spread out as the story was clear all around the world, broadcasting all around the world, and we're talking about civilians. And 2 days later, I ended my duty in the Israeli channel. I opened the radio from the Israeli news, and I just heard that they started to blame that maybe it's not an Israeli shuttle. Maybe it's not Israeli immune, and they wounded by Palestinian ammunition, by Qassam rockets. And I called Dr. Abuelaish and said, look, I think we have a problem, and we have to solve it. And he said, look, tomorrow they scheduled surgery to my daughter to take up a shrapnel from her hand. And I told him, I advised him, don't do nothing. We must keep our hand to take this shrapnel for evidence. And I came to the hospital. We met the vice director of the hospital, Professor Avi Walden. He is a very courageous man. We told him the story, what we were afraid of, and he told us, don't be afraid. I can't give you the shrapnel, but I can take it and keep it with me. I promise you, I'll keep the shrapnel in my safe, and it will be the evidence for you. 2 or 3 days later, IDF delegation came to the hospital and gave apologies to Dr. Abuelaish about what happened.
And the apology was completed. I want to do something which moves me a great deal, and I expect many of you, because this is a very special moment for these two remarkable men, is to invite Dr. Abuelaish onto the stage to be here with Shlomi, to be again with Shlomi as they were all those years ago. Visiting. Sit a second. Please. So we just have a couple of minutes, but to have these two gents talking up here for a second is really very special. And I want to ask you both, Shlomi, because you know the answer to this, Ziauddin, but I mean, this created a friendship, obviously, that has been very deep in your lives as a result. You came together over an extraordinary tragedy, but out of it has come hope and goodness because of what you decided to do immediately after the tragedy. Isn't that right, Shlomi?
Yes.
Like the next day, to look after the living and to try to make this into something that would change lives around the world. So we all know that education and the education of girls is so important. But do you, Shlomi, also believe that the degree to which education is important as a social determinant of change, that can have an extraordinary effect
Yes,
on such conflict-ridden places?
I think, first of all, we need women in politics in the Middle East. They probably can bring more compassion to the area, and we need it. And I must say something more. I've met during my career in Gaza Strip many Palestinians who were born in refugees camp and were very determined to succeed, like Dr. Abuelaish. He was born in refugees in a refugees camp in Gaza Strip, in Jabalia. I have other friend, Dr. Abuelaish. He also was born in Al-Jabalia refugees camp. And I'm sure that no one of you ever visited Gaza Strip or even refugee camp. You can't imagine. For me, it's a secret, and I can't imagine how they've done it. It's a poverty. It's a desperate. It's a kind of place that you can't imagine how they can done it, and they did it.
Yeah, and they have done it. And also Daughters for Life. I mean, the scholars of Daughters for Life. I know this as a past member of the board. So many of the scholars have themselves come from refugee camps in different countries. And there is, Daughters for Life is without, pays no attention to religious denominations or to region or country. All scholars, girl scholars, are welcome. And many of them come from refugee camps. Isn't that not right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we now have to leave to let the evening get on. But we have here two men of such extraordinary moral courage.
Can I say a few words?
Yes, please.
It's important.
I thought you were looking at me as if you didn't want to.
Because in my success, I am in debt to my mother, my wife, and my daughters and the children. And now I am in debt. My daughter Shada and my children are in debt till they're saving their lives for a courageous man, Shlomi, who has the moral courage and to prove journalism, medicine, and education transcends borders, ethnicity, religion, and it's the human equalizer and the stabilizer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's get so.